Dr. Jung comments that Westerners hide their heart under the cloak of rationality, of scientific understanding, logos. What Richard Wilhelm did for Dr. Jung is that he penetrated deeply enough to find this pearl of intuitive insight, and it was not pigeonholed by the specialists. And so Dr. Jung was able to understand it from a psychological point of view. And there's always a risk, as Dr. Jung points out in paragraph 2, of creating another silo. And so Jung's comment here is science must serve, it errs when it usurps. And its insufficiency must be supported by others. In other words, we need to be able to think in proper imagery. And I'm going to use as an example a NASA probe that was sent to Mars. And the NASA probe was going out to Mars for whatever it was, 7 or 9 months. And it was supposed to orbit Mars. And so it went around the back of Mars, but then when it was supposed to come out the other side, it disappeared. And after a long period of study, what they discovered was that certain parts of the probe, which were related to the navigation of the probe, were done with metric measure, while the most of the probe was made in the United States and therefore was non-metric. And so it was so the measures that were used to build the probe were incompatible, and the result was that Mars probe just disappeared out into space. And maybe some alien will find it in 1 billion years or so and be quizzical about the measures. But we have to be able to think through these things beyond just the rigid rationality and the rigid mathematics, let's say. So science obscures insight when it claims its understanding is the only kind. What could possibly go wrong? That's what we need to understand. For example, the words, let's talk about that in terms of the logos in the Constitution of the United States. Well, the Constitution was always very clear to everyone, but now all of a sudden it's not so clear. And so we need to be able to think through and beyond just the words. We need to understand what can possibly go wrong. And so Westerners fold... So Westerners tend to put Oriental wisdom into a dim box of faith and superstition, and they don't really appreciate exactly how the Eastern person might be looking at a specific issue, as I explained with Otoko at the beginning of this. So the realism of the East grew from instinct and the highly evolved Chinese mind. And Dr. Jung gained a new appreciation for this when in 1928 Richard Wilhelm brought him his translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower. And the result was that he saw some very important things for him. And so what happens when a decision that makes sense is piled onto a decision that makes sense is piled onto another decision that makes sense? Well, one example would be my metaphor of the stop sign, where it certainly makes sense to put a stop sign at a busy intersection, or let's say a less than busy intersection, where it would be enough for cars to stop and then go again. But the problem is that if you put that stop sign out in the middle of the prairie, let's say in the middle of Montana or Utah, and you put that stop sign there, and when you're coming up to that stop sign, you can see for 5 miles in both directions. Are you going to come to a full stop and stop completely before you go on? And so this is where we get into the godlike decisions, which I've discussed earlier, where we have to follow Christ's parable of the unjust steward, where Christ came upon a man who was working on the Sabbath, and Christ asked him what he was doing, and the man said, "Well, I'm working." And Christ said, well, if you know what you're doing, then you are blessed. But if you don't know what you're doing, then you're cursed and a violator of the law. And so this relates to the stop sign. If you know what you're doing and you're out in the middle of the prairie and there's no cars coming in both directions, and you can see that clearly, then maybe you don't have to stop so firmly at a stop sign. But if you don't know what you're doing and you just go through a stop sign, you're making a godlike decision, and you might kill yourself or someone else. That's the significance of that parable. So going into paragraph 3 now, Dr. Jung is talking about, it's similar to the student in Faustus who is taking everything word for word. And if you take over yoga practices word for word, you become a pitiable imitator. So, I've often quipped that there are yoga teachers in Nebraska, and I've gone to yoga classes at my local gym, and what you hear in those yoga classes is a teacher who is basically parroting Hindu philosophy during the yoga class very often. And but the problem is that she's not a Hindu guru. I mean, she's just saying a few nice surface level platitudes, but she's not really understanding what it is she's doing in that class. And so you can lose yourself in a mist of words and ideas, and this is part of the problem of being too overcome by the logos, as we've talked about on a number of occasions. Let me just look here. Andy Oxide says, is the logos the source of intuitive insight? Absolutely not. The source of intuitive insight is the Eros, the right brain. And Dan Paul says, paragraph 2, science must serve it errs when it usurps the throne. What is the throne? Personal truths. What it means is that we cannot be too rigid in our understanding from a logos point of view. I mean, you can learn things, you can learn all the rules when you're in engineering school, let's say, but then you have to learn how things really work. And the same goes for marriage, for example. You can learn all the rules for marriage, both the moral rules and whatever your father or your mother might tell you, but then you have to get married and actually get in bed with your spouse, and you might find that the rules are somewhat different than you thought they were. And you also might find that you're in a dance or a wrestling match with the side of your spouse that you don't know, that is wrestling with the side of you that you don't know. For example, I occasionally find my feminine side in a wrestling match with my wife's animus, her masculine side. And it's always good to be able to know that and to understand that about us. So rules are great. The Logos is great. The Logos has got us scientific development over the last 500 years, which we would not have if we didn't have Logos and the ability to differentiate things. And, we wouldn't be going to Mars at all if we didn't have Logos. But on the other hand, there are bounds. We have to understand that there has to be a balance. And this is actually one of the reasons why in the U.S. military there's emphasis on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, because it's always useful. It's all well and good to use your sensing, thinking side, which is very common among military officers, to work out a mission plan, let's say. But you need intuitive people to ask the question and understand the possibilities of what could possibly go wrong. And you need the feeling people to understand, whether it's going to work, and whether people that you're dealing with, civilians perhaps, are going to, how they're going to react to you. Let me give you an example. While I was serving in Vietnam, it happened that I was an interrogation officer, and one of the activities that we did was divide people that were captured by the Marines between prisoners of war, civil defendants, which were people who had helped our enemy but were not gun-carrying people, and innocent civilians. And so there came a time when a sort of guy who might have been my age now, maybe he was in the 75-year-old range, but in Vietnam 50 years ago, that was very old indeed. So this very wiry guy who's 75 years old gets rounded up by the Marines and brought into us, and we have to decide whether he's a prisoner of war, a civil defendant, or an innocent civilian. So one of the questions was, did you ever help the Viet Cong? And he said, yes, I carried rice for the Viet Cong down from North Vietnam on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so in our way of looking at it, that made him a civil defendant. And so that was not an issue for the Marines or the military to deal with. That was an issue for the local constabulary. He was a civil defendant. And so we would take people like that out to the local headquarters and turn them over to the local police. So in that particular case, the local police put him in jail for 2 weeks as a punishment for helping the Viet Cong. And then 2 weeks later, about maybe 300 or 400 detainees later, he comes through again. And I said, wow, does this guy look familiar? Let's look back in our records and see if we have his name. And sure enough, we had his name and we did recognize him. So, again, we asked him, have you ever helped the Viet Cong? And he said, yes, I helped the Viet Cong carry rice down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Same answer. And so here we are stuck in this endless loop. And so we didn't have any choice. We were Marines, aye, sir. And so having that answer, we had no choice but to take him back out to the local constabulary. And the poor man must have thought that he was on a merry-go-round. Anyway, so, sometimes maybe the rules need to be bent. When I was 24 years old and serving as a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps, I wasn't going to bend any rules like that, but probably it would be just as well to let the guy go, because he had been in jail in the interim of the previous 2 weeks, and so he's on his way out of jail and the Marines pick him up again. Oh, I see. Thomas is talking about the point being it was related to the Myers-Briggs reference. Going back then, the point is that in military missions, we're trained, and this happened to me at every senior school I attended, that we would take and be trained in the Myers-Briggs, and so my scores tended to get even more rigidly fixed in where they were. But the point is that military officers who are going places, let's say, who haven't been weeded out, tend to be S and T people. They get all the details and they can think about the details, but they can't think. They're not very good at thinking about what could possibly go wrong, and they're not very good at thinking at what the consequences of this plan might be for innocent civilians and what have you. And so we're trained in the U.S. military to include within our teams people that have all the personality types, or at least of the four main personality types: sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling. We need in all of our teams people from all those personality types so that we can think through the problem thoroughly. And Jerome says, not sure about your statement about yoga teachers. Yoga does provide techniques to access the Eros side. Well, I agree with that, Jerome, and also I agree that my comments are trying to follow Dr. Jung's text, but let's keep in mind that Dr. Jung was writing 90 years ago, and he was quite ignorant about the East. He admitted in the foreword of the book and in various places throughout the essay that he was only just getting exposed to China and to Eastern thought for the first time. And in fact, Richard Wilhelm's interaction with him really saved him, because he was discovering things over the period from 1913 to 1928 in his own experience, in his own Red Book experience, and in his consulting room, which he could not place in human thought. He was trying to place it in human thought historically, and he wasn't finding a handle in Western thought or a proper connection. He had an intuition that it had something to do with alchemy, but it was only when Richard Wilhelm came back from China in 1928 and brought to him the secret of he brought to him the entire I Ching, and including the secret of the golden flower. And by talking with Dr. Jung and explaining to him what it was, Dr. Jung says, aha, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And the significant thing, which we'll get to in a moment here, is that the symbols that were coming up in dreams and visions of his patients were identical to symbols that came up in Chinese psyches in The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is thousands of years old. So that really allowed him to connect up and was basically the reason why he then wrote 3 major books on alchemy.